I'm going to move over here so everyone can focus on them for the questions. I believe there are microphones set up at the back of the room. Raphael, are they going to be passed around, or are people expected to line up? Okay, everyone can come, please line up. I do have questions myself, but I'll let you ask away first. Any questions for our panelists? Yes, please come to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Bo Frederick. I work for the Environment Commissioner. I had a question concerning food security. I was quite surprised that you mentioned that it's a big issue. For someone that doesn't know Arctic issues, when you look at agricultural data, we export most of our food compared to what we consume. Could you elaborate specifically what food insecurity entails and how Canada could actually do something so it doesn't become such a big issue in the Arctic? Thank you.
I can start us off. So food security among Inuit in Canada is a pretty profound challenge. The main driver of food insecurity is poverty throughout Inuit Nunangat. The prevalence of food insecurity, there's really a range. So Jackie presented some numbers for Nunavut. We're in the process of actually collecting more up-to-date food security data through our Inuit Health Survey that Inuit are developing and leading. But it ranges, upwards of, in Nunavut, the last number that I saw for children in Nunavut, which is just one of the 4 regions, was nearly 70% of Inuit children experience some level of food security, insecurity, and there are different dimensions when it comes to food security. The main challenge is poverty, as I pointed out. So there's a massive median income gap between Inuit and non-Inuit, just within Inuit Nunangat, of about $70,000 median income, and that's influenced by a variety of factors, low educational attainment, household crowding, limited access to the basic services that many Canadians take for granted. So it's a really complex challenge. At ITK, we're in the process of writing a national Inuit food security strategy. The strategy will focus on a number of the things that we know can be done to enhance Inuit food security, to improve access to foods. Things like the food system in Inuit Nunangat. Jackie sort of touched on it. A lot of foods are shipped in the summer. Throughout the rest of the year, most of the year, they're flown in. That drives up food prices. You combine high prices of food with low incomes and other challenges. It gets hard pretty quick. The existing federal program, the Nutrition North Canada program, for years, it's sort of a notorious federal program in the sense that many Inuit believe it just doesn't really isn't having the impact it was intended to. Even its intended impact is sort of questionable. There is a hunter support grant that was announced by the federal government this past fall that isn't. We'll see if that transpires after the election, but that could be one innovative, not solution to the problem, but it could help mitigate it. The gist of it is that hunters would have access to federal dollars in order to support their harvesting activities for the communities they live in.
Just quickly to add to that, it's infrastructure. There's such a lack of infrastructure that the cost of bringing in food is enormous. So flying in food is untenable, and then you can only get food in by ships once a year right now. Each community is resupplied by ship once a year. So you can imagine how much toilet paper and different things that people buy once a year. You've seen it, dog food, just unloading, and it's hard. And so one question, how many of you bought a watermelon this summer? Mm-hmm. How much did you pay for it? 79 cents. Well, here you go. I saw a watermelon for sale this year in, where was I? Maybe Joe Haven, for $78. And that's an extreme example.
I would just add, this is just another point about food security, that in addition to the cost and the poverty, which are clearly the enormous issues, another issue that's affecting food security is the inability to get so-called country foods, including seal and whale to some extent, char, because of the changing ice conditions, as well as land-based food like caribou. And on top of that, because of the contaminant transport I talked about, there's papers and research out there that some of these country foods are high in some contaminants, and therefore there's a question of whether is it safe, never mind if you can actually get the country food, but is it safe to eat, and how safe is it? So that adds on top of the poverty, on top of the accessibility, the actual ability to do, and now of course country foods of course has important social and other aspects, but simply economic and health aspects are also part of it.
Thank you. Monsieur Dupont? Yes, if you can just formalize.
Merci, Den. Merci pour vos présentations. I've just, I guess, a two-part question. I'm looking for, shall we say, more positive messages of ways in which one can address what is an obviously a seriously complex set of issues. And I guess my question would be around the whole notion about capacity here. What is being done with respect to building a capacity within the North, by the North, for the North, around the whole notion of bridging this traditional knowledge, so-called Western science, put that in quotes, or community-based knowledge, if you wish. And I mean, are you seeing signs that we're starting to get more integration and opportunities for solving some of these more complex issues through that? I'll leave it at that. Merci.
Who would like to start?
This is a great point. And this is, I always say, I mean, we were told to talk about this, are we stressing the Arctic? So we talked about how we're stressing it. But I totally agree. And usually when I give a presentation, I always say, Canada is in a fantastic position, actually, because we are not overbuilt. We are underbuilt in the Arctic. And so we have and importantly, we have settled land claim agreements. And you can argue about the strength or weaknesses of those, but we have them and they're important. So we have the basic structures to do it right. And we've got a little bit of time to do it right. And so there are many things that we need to be doing. And you mentioned a big one, which is working in the North, for the North. So the North leading these, and as a scientist, we're starting new programs. One's called the North by North program through ArcticNet, where it's completely led by the North. So we're trying to start focusing our scientific questions on questions that actually are coming out of the North, instead of the ones that we think up in our labs or with our computer models that we think would be interesting. And we really need to shift that way. But we do have the opportunity to develop the Canadian Arctic in an innovative and sustainable way in the future. And we can do that. I don't know how yet.
Maybe just a very brief comment on so-called the part of the comment on let's call it Western science and traditional and ecological or environmental science. I think in my career of 30 years in the Arctic, there's been a definite sea change in that view, and certainly it's being integrated much more, and every year integrated more than the year before. And I'm sure Tim will arguably argue correctly, perhaps, or will argue correctly that it's not enough in many situations, but at least I always say direction first, velocity later. At least I think we're going in the right direction. If we're looking for something positive to say, I don't know if Tim will agree with me, but a direction first, velocity later, or we'll hope to get velocity fast.
Just quickly, I think the silver lining is that we've seen in the last several years the government responding to Inuit solutions that have been put on the table to many of the challenges that I highlighted and others highlighted. we released a national Inuit suicide prevention strategy in 2016, a climate strategy earlier this year, as well as a national Inuit strategy on research last year. So the hunter support program that I mentioned earlier was an idea that Inuit had been lobbying for many years. Hopefully that will come to pass, but the Inuit Health Survey is another example, which will gather longitudinal baseline health data about the health priorities identified by Inuit going forward. So the silver lining, I think, is that there's a sort of a slow. The government, the federal government, is slowly waking up to the idea that Inuit are in a position to identify solutions that really are beneficial to governments as well, because they enhance the effectiveness and impact of any spending, and the effectiveness and impact of program delivery. So,
Thank you.
Hi, John Rankos, University of Ottawa. I'll have to play a little bit devil's advocate here. What's wrong with bunches of tour ships going through the Northwest Passage? We read all this, cruise ships disgorging 2,000 tourists, spending millions of dollars in the Caribbean. Why are we discouraging this, and how are we going to manage this if it happens?
Who would like to tackle that first?
yeah, I would say, among many Inuit communities, there are a variety of perspectives about this. There are some people, some communities that have embraced tourism, and others that may not have embraced it or are thinking about it in the same way. I was in Pond Inlet this summer, and there's a landing fee of about $75 per person that was put into place this summer. So that can add up pretty quickly, and that can help. It can fill the coffers of a hamlet government, and help that hamlet government improve its services and improve the community infrastructure that's in place. So and then there are people who are hunters who don't like where some cruise ships are going, because they may disturb narwhal migrations or narwhal activities that then links to challenges such as food security that we just talked about. So I just say that there's a different views on this among Inuit. It isn't all just negative. So.
Any other perspectives to add there?
No, I agree. It's absolutely mixed, and it's how it's managed that matters, not, and there's going to be tourism. And my concern is that a lot of the tourism operators are not owned and run by Inuit or Northerners. It's usually American companies, German companies coming in. So the dollars that are coming in my view, although it's, the new passenger tax, we're not allowed to call it a tax actually, the passenger fee, the landing fee, is great. But the millions of dollars are not staying in the region. So there's, it's a mixed bag like any economy, and it just has to be managed well.
Yeah, I have a different type of question for you. I've, over my career, seen many technologies that would be very beneficial to the North, and people want to take them there. And I know several groups that have actually gone to the North with proposals, and they can't get financing up there. Now, that's not really the big problem. It's the Southern financiers, those who went to business schools and have MBAs in finance. They don't make decisions. This is a new market for technology. And now, I think that's a market barrier. They're not going to fund things there because they're not, they all want to be the first one to be fourth, not the first one to be first up there with new technologies, and those take investments. So what have you got for ideas for how we can actually get funds guaranteed or something in the North so that people can actually take these things? I've seen things on and gasification of waste, new housing techniques, techniques for infrastructure, probably a lot of them because it came out of Ottawa U, is the container hydroponics. But everywhere that these people that I know go, you can't get financing there. And most of the programs that are coming out of governments are paying for people to use something, but the thing's not there to get them to use it. So you have to overcome the barrier that the financiers aren't going to do it because they're from the south and they just want that guaranteed market.
Okay. No, this is a great point. And so you're talking about sort of larger scale infrastructure and technologies, but also starting up a small business. So, most people in the Arctic don't own their homes, so they don't have any equity to get a small grant for their businesses. In addition, a lot of people don't even speak English because, the language of Inuit is Inuktitut, among others. And so there are major challenges, but there are organizations. There's an organization I know about called Tides Canada, and they're trying to raise money through philanthropy and other things to create small business loans for people to do some of this. But there are major challenges because the risks are huge, and the payoff is low. So, I mean, you make a really good point. There's also really important reports coming out of the federal government where they argue that we shouldn't be financing the North the way we finance the South because the tax base the tax base isn't there. How many people live in the Arctic, Tim? I can't remember. How many? 65,000. I mean, how much infrastructure dollars can you get for 65,000? And we are servicing the world in the Arctic. You heard John talk about the Arctic climate services the global climate. The Arctic Ocean services the global ocean. And soon it's going to be economically as well when we see trade through the Arctic. So we need to be thinking differently in the Arctic. And I just don't know how well we're doing that right now. But we need to be innovative, and we can be innovative if we start working together and we stop being siloed in our policy making and siloed in our scientific thinking and siloed, in our partnerships with Inuit and other Indigenous organizations. Not helpful.
Any other comments, or moving on to the next question?
Hello, I'm Sharon Janot. I'm a senior fellow with the Center on Governance at the university here. My question, I guess, is for all of you. And I'd like to get your perceptions on how all of these developments, tourism, resource extraction, climate change, what kind of an impact are they having on the people of the North from a cultural viewpoint, like on the culture of the North?
There are 65,000 Inuit in Canada. Most Inuit live in one of the 51 communities of Inuit Nunangat, and most Inuit speak Inuktitut as their first, only, or preferred language. The challenge when it comes to challenges associated with cultural revitalization are really complex. You've all heard about the impacts of residential schooling, and there are myriad challenges associated with staffing schools with the numbers of Inuktitut teachers required to provide Inuktitut language of instruction in schools and so on. So I won't get too far into that, but what could the implications be of sort of the emerging challenges that are on the horizon? I think we've heard, for example, about the links between climate and harvesting. So if it becomes more challenging to harvest country foods, whales, seals, fish, walrus, polar bears, a lot of the way that the knowledge that people have about how that's been done and that the knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation becomes really vulnerable in that kind of context. It's also becomes vulnerable in a context where, because people may not be able to afford to do those things because they don't have enough money to do so, that also is a factor. When it comes to shipping, I mean, the impacts of shipping or in tourism on animal populations, I think there's anecdotal evidence that we hear about, but that isn't really well understood. And as shipping or tourism or economic development ramps up, for example, that too could put added pressure on just the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, and the language that knowledge is often transmitted in. You look at something like the Mary River Iron Mine near Pond Inlet, for example, and the ships that transport the iron ore south and then over to Europe, really. And even that is really, I don't want to say divided, but there are strong views on either side when it comes to just that one project, when it comes to its impacts on animal populations, on economic opportunities for the community, and the list goes on. So, short answer is that I think that transmission of culture and language, it is already under stress and has been for many decades. And many of the challenges that we've all spoken to are going to increase that stress in myriad ways. So, thanks.
Okay. Yes, next question.
Hi, I'm Peter McKinnon, and I'm a long time involved in the North. I was a glaciologist at the Polar Continental Shelf Project, just as background. So I have a comment to start with, and perhaps you were at this, Tim, but there's a new National Geographic movie that is about to be released. Its world premiere has not happened yet, but there was a private screening at the Museum of Nature recently. It's called Last Ice. So do watch for it, because everything you've heard the panel speak about is talked about in this particular movie, and it's also done very much from the native's point of view. It's a very, very powerful movie. Last Ice, and it'll be out probably sometime later this year. I have a question, I guess, to John in particular, and it's a two-part. One is about the sort of environment part, the other is about the biology part. So the environment part, you talked about the release of carbon dioxide, of course, from melting of permafrost. I was going to also suggest that one needs to look at the issue of methyl calathrates. Calathrates are made by methane, the release of methane, and methane is in fact far more absorbent of energy from the sun, let's say, than carbon dioxide, in fact many times more. And there are massive amounts of calathrate in the north, both at the ocean floor level and under permafrost. I'm just wondering if you've got any experience or know people who've been studying this particular issue with respect to climate change. That's part one.
Can I answer that first? Or just to deal with this first question, that's a very good point. And of course, there were a whole variety of environmental sins I could have listed. This was just one more, and it's true. I mentioned carbon dioxide, but this would be a major release of methane. Methane is about, I think, 25 times stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. There are massive amounts of methane also in the terrestrial system, but these calathrates, if they do start releasing, this is what we so worry about, what I call positive feedbacks and thresholds. You get the environment warm enough, and there's a lot under the ocean as well. Mm-hmm. You get the environment warm enough, you start massively releasing, it melts enough that you would get massive releases of not only CO2 but methane. Of course, that it warms even more, and you almost get like, and the chain reaction is probably not the right word, but it's a positive feedback. And of course, that releases more calathrates, more methane, and then you're into a system that is, so it's just one more area that we worry about with these positive feedbacks and reaching these thresholds where there's almost no return. And that's what worries us. It's very hard to go backwards in the environment. Once you've passed a threshold, you've lost options, basically, and that would be a classic one.
The second part of the question, if I may, is more about, to a biologist, I suppose, or I'm wondering what you're seeing in your own research and that of your colleagues with respect to changing vectors of disease in regard to animals, humans, and plants.
So,
thank you.
Changing vectors, that's not directly in my area, but one thing we're definitely seeing is with warming, you've got animals, not just humans going through the north, but animals and plants from the south moving north as it gets warmer. And some of these are seen now as exotic species. In fact, until recently, there was no Inuktitut word for robin. And now there's robins in Iqaluit, for example. But there's also insects I've seen in my own work where I've gone for many years. And now we see insects we never saw before. And there's actually a commission in making words for animals and so forth that weren't there. These are to some extent, one, they could be bringing in vectors of disease, which is always a possibility. We always worry about this with so-called exotic or invasive species. The other thing, many of them are probably displacing the northern species. And the northern species at a certain point have nowhere else to go. They need the cold, they're adapted to the cold, and they're running out of their habitat. So this is actually a very important biological problem. It also comes up with I don't want to use winners and losers, but let's use those words. There are always, with climate change, winners and losers. Some do better, some do worse. But very often who's winning is not really the organisms you want in these ecosystems. So this is a very new area. It's happening very quickly. But we're seeing fish moving north, trout moving north, where only char used to be before. And it's not well studied, and it can have very strong consequences.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Claire Lenoir. I work for the Meteorological Service of Canada. Thank you all for being here, sharing your knowledge and your experience. I will ask a policy question. There's a lot of different stressors going on in the Arctic. You guys have alluded to a couple of them. I'm wondering if you could speak to any current policies that are exacerbating that stress. And I'll follow that. Take a breath. Your thoughts on the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, particularly Tim's view.
Okay. Who would like to tackle that one first?
Yeah. So when it comes to policy at the most basic level, I'll just speak to one challenge. Until recently, the federal government hasn't really contemplated Inuit Nunangat as a cohesive cultural, geographic, political region. It is thought of the North, meaning the Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut, but it hasn't really had that view of the Inuit homeland. And we've had some wins in that respect when it comes to federal budgets that they recognize the Inuit regions within Inuit Nunangat, in some cases allocate funds directly to them. But the main policy challenge, I would say, at the most basic level is what we call an Inuit Nunangat policy. So we advocate for the federal government to implement an Inuit Nunangat policy in the development of any federal policy, program, or initiative or legislation that is intended to benefit Inuit. And there's a really practical reason for that. It's because oftentimes federal programs aren't accessible to some regions, to some Inuit regions, while they might be accessible to others. And so a program that might be intended to benefit Northerners, for example, might be accessible only to the Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Nunavut, but there are Inuit who live in northern Quebec and also in Nunatsiavut, northern Labrador, who simply can't access maybe a federal funding stream despite living in communities with the exact same challenges and being the exact same people. And then on the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, it's, I think, just a very general reaction to it is that we were involved as genuine partners in developing many aspects of it. I think that it's an imperfect document, and the way that it was released was really peculiar and confusing to many people. But the ambition of bringing Inuit Nunangat, bringing the North into Canada through a nation-building exercise that is equivalent to other nation-building initiatives such as the Trans-Canada Railway, for example. Thinking the document, I think it it presents an ambition that that I think is really what we need in order to address many of the challenges that I've spoken about and that others have as well. So, thanks.
Your first question is a good one, and there are a lot of examples. It's hard to think about them, but I think that Tim alluded to the idea of sort of the southernization of policy, and we make policies in the South often. We're doing a better job than we used to do, but sometimes policies that are created in the South just really don't work in the North, and it's not thought through. So I'll give you two more specific examples. One example is we have, through our Canadian Shipping Act, we have something that's called cabotage. And so if any cruise ship starts and ends an itinerary within a Canadian port, so you start in a Canadian port and you end in a Canadian port, you have to pay an enormous duty tax. And that's for lots of reasons that don't really matter for this example. But what that means is that no cruise ships ever start and end in Canadian ports. And that's easy to do in the South because you just start in Seattle and go up the coast or whatever. But in the Arctic, it would be really wonderful to see an Inuit-owned cruise ship, which this used to be the case, that would start in Iqaluit and take you through the Northwest Passage and maybe end you in Kuguktuk or something. We don't, and that's enormous. We know that the most amount of money spent on a cruise ship is in the first port and the last port. So we're losing half of our economic potential in a region that needs this, more than other regions. And it's because of our policy that we're trying to support our Canadian maritime organizations, which already make a lot of money. So so most ships start in Greenland to avoid that tax. So that's a policy side effect that directly impacts the lives of Northerners. Another one is that after 9/11, there was new Transport Canada implemented these new regulations because of sort of terrorism around ports. And so there's all these things that are really useful in the South, like having a fence around your airport and partitioning off the area of the port and having nobody in that region for the 12 hours before the ship comes in. Well, these ships are anchoring off and coming into a beach that is not contained and is not going to have a 12-foot high fence around it. So when you get off, we try to follow these rules, but it's kind of ridiculous. We put pylons out and it just doesn't work. But that's just an example. We don't think these things through because we don't create policy with people in the North who could have easily told you that this isn't working. We are doing a better job, but we're not. And I would just agree with what Tim said on the framework. It's an imperfect document with peculiarities. I would like to have seen science a bit more profiled in there, but that's my own personal bias.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. So great to see you all again. I just want to give a real shout out to what Tim said quickly. The National Inuit Strategy on Research. And it says, in response to Paul, the strategy identifies areas for partnerships and action that can strengthen the impact and effectiveness of Inuit research for Inuit. So, I mean, it's kind of, it's a great document. I remember when we were learning about it in 2018 that there's not every place that has a research strategy, that every, and that I think that's really, really important document. But I want to get to, and Jackie, your comment just at the end kind of said this. I've studied Canada a long time, and particularly given recent things, I had the chance to learn more about Arctic sustainability and so on, and I thought I was making progress. And then this summer, I was in the high Arctic for 2 weeks, and I decided I don't know anything. And, the big conclusion I came away from that was, on the one hand, wow, I don't know anything. But on the other hand, I did get, thanks to a whole bunch of people and a lot of learning, that we've got to do something about the fact that people like me don't get it unless you actually, and then it gets us back to what I saw up there. A lot of the tourists, they're not Canadians. So, there are a lot of people up there from what I can see, but Canadians are just a group of these. And so how do we get to learn, how do we manage, and I totally get, Tim's, your comment about, I have a little sense now of the complexity of this. We're not in the Caribbean. And I don't think a lot of those analogies, are going to be helpful here. But I think there must be, this managing, thinking it through, getting ways to make this work such that, I find it interesting. I remember when Harper started, he kept going to the Arctic. And now I know our Governor General's going there all the time. So clearly, but somehow that then doesn't translate into what all of you are saying in terms of understanding that when you talk about Canada, this is an Arctic country that now is in a global situation here. And I want to believe the idea that we can play a real role in making the world go better somehow by doing things properly. But how do we get there? How do we get the urgency, I guess, is my question, to see if we can't do better on that? Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.
What do you guys think?
I will assign someone in a few moments.
Go ahead, Tim.
Just briefly, I mentioned in my first comments that there is really a unparalleled international interest and activity in the Arctic, and that is, I think, the main driver of Canada's emerging ambition when it comes to Inuit Nunangat, to the Arctic. For so many decades, it has just been overlooked and neglected, and that's reflected in just the profound infrastructure gaps that exist. I can't stress that enough. The gaps are profound. I mean, if you go to Nain, Nunatsiavut, tomorrow you will not have cell phone service. I'm not talking about LTE or 5G. There's just you can't call anyone on your cell phone. It just won't work there. You can't land on the runway at night because there are no runway lights. And there's no money to pay for the runway lights. So I think Canada seems to be waking up to that reality that unless it brings Inuit Nunangat into Canada, which what it comes down to is money, investing a whole lot of money in the development of the region, someone else will. And we saw that in Greenland recently, actually. I'm not talking about the attempted purchase of Greenland from Denmark, but China wanted to basically invest in the development of 3 airstrips in Greenland. It wanted to partner with the government of Greenland to build 3 airstrips, force the government of Denmark to step up and support those initiatives. So I think the really weird silver lining to the growing interest in the region is that I think it's causing some pause, and in some cases it's causing governments to think about I guess the role that they should be playing in supporting the people who live there.
I mean, that is the $1 million question, and this is what we think about all the time. And I'm always scratching my head. And I think, one, we need to get over the population argument. In my right after grad school, when I was trying to get a job, I interviewed with the federal government, and I got a question. I can't remember what the question was, but I argued that we should be investing in the Arctic, infrastructure in the Arctic. And they said to me, well, there's not a population base, so we can't do that. And that is the same argument that I hear when I go into meetings today. Well, we don't have the population base, so we can't do this. We have to get over that argument. We cannot think about it that way. So we have to figure out, and I would say ITK has done one heck of a job in the last few years, creating storylines, true storylines, factual storylines to get us to understand this in a greater capacity. So I think working together, we haven't done a great job working together. Scientists don't always do a good job working together, policymakers, and we need to work together. And I think that, especially on the political level, so I think, I don't know, But I think, the Liberals couldn't really make the Arctic their baby because the Conservatives did. And even though the Liberals arguably might have invested more in the Arctic in the last few years, it was always underplayed, I think, for political reasons. So I just hope we can get to a point where we can all work together on this, and start to understand that we are an Arctic nation, and we need to act like that. And I don't know, at least we have, a Governor General right now that is very keen on the Arctic. Our recent science minister was an Arctic scientist. We'll see what happens in the next little while. But even with that contingent, we struggled to maintain focus on the Arctic. So if you have some ideas, let us know.
Thank you. Last question.
My name is Tony Lefkovich. I'm a professor here in the University of Ottawa, and I'm also president of the Canadian Permafrost Association, but you'd be pleased to know I'm not going to ask about permafrost. So this summer, I had an amazing opportunity to go back to Northern Banks Island, where I did my graduate work exactly 40 years ago. So I had not been there since 1979, and I went back in 2019. And most of what I saw was still entirely recognizable. I could find my sites. We didn't have GPS back then, so I knew where they were. I could actually find the locations. There was the odd post in the ground that I'd left. But it made me start to think about change through time. So 40 years is within a career, within a lifespan. So I wanted to ask you as panelists, because we've heard a lot about things that are changing, most of them related to problems because you were asked to talk about stresses. But if we think ahead 40 years, so I'm asking you to think ahead 40 years, to around about 2060. So what are the things that you think in your areas will still be recognizable, and areas that might have changed profoundly? And for those things that have changed profoundly and negatively perhaps in your assessment, are there policies we need to put in place, that we could put in place, that will try and mitigate those changes?
Well, I can probably start from my own scientific perspective. I've already seen tremendous changes. I've been through the circumpolar Arctic, but about every 3 years we went to a series of 40 ponds on Ellesmere Island that I went for the very first time as a young 20-something in 1983. And we also have sediment cores. We know the history since the Ice Age of what these ponds are. And we started saying in the sediment record, we saw already tremendous changes happening in this century. And then we were predicting that if warming continues, these ponds, which are not permafrost ponds, but they're excavated in granite, they will disappear, we thought, in the next 100 years. Well, they started evaporating in 2006, and we were stunned. And we could show they were evaporating because we had water chemistry data showing that. So what were aquatic ecosystems are now dry land. That's a threshold type change. So we've already seen this happening, and granted, this is a very sensitive part of the Arctic, Ellesmere Island, shallow sites. So we're already seeing that. So that's going to be terrestrial land in the future. Now, of course, there's winners and losers. One thing you see more is you see more Arctic hare because there's more grassland, for example. But from an ecosystem perspective, that already looks tremendously different than what I've seen in my own lifetime as an Arctic researcher. So if any of these predictions are correct, I mean, if it's business as usual of going up like 10 degrees centigrade, I mean, it's unbelievable how it will be totally unrecognizable, I think. So, it's almost too horrific to even think about if we don't actually meet even the meager Paris targets, which are going to translate as how I started this. Everyone says 1.5 degrees. Even those targets, if we meet them, is about 3 degrees centigrade for the Arctic. So it's a tremendous change.
I'm trying to be positive. I think sea ice is changing dramatically, and it is going to have these knock-on and cascading effects socioeconomically. But because in Canada specifically, because of the dynamics of the ice, basically there's a huge multi-year ice pack in the Arctic Ocean, and it's multi-year ice, which means it never melts. But it is starting to break up. And what's happening is that ice is just flowing right down into the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and we didn't really understand this until about 10 years ago. And I'm not a sea ice scientist, so I'm repeating information. I'm not telling you my expertise. But what I think is interesting is everyone thinks it's going to be open, and it's not. And it's going to be like that for quite some time. So we are going to need policies in place to combat this. Right now, there are almost no policies for yachts. A yacht can go where it wants, when it wants. It has to register. And ideally it registers and it tells the Coast Guard where it's going for safety reasons. But from a commercial perspective, it could be quite concerning. The polar code that we have in place is really in place for larger vessels that are ice strengthened. So I don't think we're going to see statistically significant reductions in sea ice presence, but we are seeing statistically significant reductions in sea ice, melt overall. But in the Canadian Arctic, it's still going to be there from a sort of economic perspective. So that's not going to change. I think that what will change profoundly is the tourism numbers. 10 years ago, I wrote a paper and I said, there will never be purpose-built cruise ships for the polar regions. We will continue to charter those old clunky Russian icebreakers, and 10 were purpose-built that just commissioned last year. So that is profound. So that says to me, okay, these companies they're seeing the future. So I think we are. A lot of people who argue with me, they're telling me I'm an alarmist. Oh, Jackie, the Northwest Passage is not going to see ships, is not going to see traffic for another 100 years, rah, rah, rah. I'm going to be alarmist. I do believe we are going to see traffic through there. It's just a matter of when, and it's a matter of commodity prices and who's bold enough to do it. And we aren't. We don't seem to be in Canada bold enough to do it, but other nations are. And we need policies in place to make sure that our homeland and the homeland of the people who were here first are protected.
Tim, would you like to have the final word?
Yeah, I mean, my simple response, what do I hope Inuit Nunangat looks like 40 years from now? I hope it looks more like Greenland than Alaska, where I'm from, in terms of just the infrastructure that exists, the basic infrastructure. I see that 3 of the 4, these 4 Inuit land claims organizations. One of them is a self-government. One of them is still negotiating a self-government agreement. It's near completing those negotiations. Another is looking into how it could achieve self-government. One has just begun the earliest talks about what self-government in northern Quebec would look like. So I think that in many ways, Inuit are already sort of ahead of the curve on some of these coming challenges. And self-government could be leveraged in really positive ways to, I think, confront the challenges and the opportunities associated with climate change, with tourism, with shipping. We're seeing that there's some strikingly positive examples of this already happening. The creation of Talurut Imanga, which is a marine protected area in northern Nunavut, the largest marine protected area in Canada. And that is a product of negotiations between Inuit from from Baffin Island and the federal government. And the way that all came to be is in a way that recognizes and imagines that there are infrastructure dimensions to the creation of a protected area like that. There are economic dimensions to it. There's the human dimension of needing to monitor it and monitor who's going in and out. So my hope is that trend will continue, and I think it will through the mechanism of Inuit self-government. And I think that can be a really positive and practical means to achieve communities that, at least from an infrastructure perspective, look more like a Greenland than look like an Alaska. So, thanks.
Thank you. So I'd like everyone to join me in thanking the panelists. And I'm going to pass the microphone over to Hela Tosin, who's the past board chair of RCI Science.